Chapter 388, Venturing Deep into the Soul-Stirring Winds. Time slowly passed by, and several days later, all of the surrounding soul-stirring winds had already formed massive black tornadoes that resembled enormous pillars connecting heaven and earth. These pillars of wind were constantly moving, occasionally overlapping with one another before separating again, and it was impossible to see anything through the suffocating darkness. Han Li flew through the giant pillars of wind, with his body encompassed within the black barrier released by the wind shelter bead. And he was doing his best not to come into direct contact with these pillars of wind, while also protecting his own consciousness as much as possible. He could clearly sense the formidable glacial aura emanating from these pillars of wind, something that he certainly didn't want to be directly exposed to. He was still advancing onward, but at a far slower rate than before. The ghastly sounds here had become significantly louder once again, and he was still able to withstand it, but he didn't dare to release his spiritual sense out of his body anymore. One's spiritual sense was an extension of one's soul, so if he were to release his spiritual sense to come into contact with the surrounding soul-stirring winds, then the effects of the ghastly sounds ringing out from within them would be exacerbated. Thankfully, he still had his bright sight spirit eyes, which allowed him to see the movement of the pillars of soul-stirring winds around him even without the use of his spiritual sense. Otherwise, it would have been extremely difficult to make any meaningful progress. All of a sudden, a giant pillar of wind surged toward Han Li at an astonishing speed, but he was able to evade it by twisting to the side like an agile fish. However, right at this moment, a black shadow shot out of the pillar of wind like a bolt of black lightning. Thankfully, Han Li was able to react in a timely fashion, sweeping his joined index and middle fingers through the air to release a streak of azure sword chi that struck the black shadow with unerring accuracy. A dull thump rang out as the black shadow was sliced into two, and the black one eye on its surface dissipated to reveal an inky black snake inside. The snake was around 10 feet in length, with 3 horns on its head, along with a pair of dark red eyes, and it was giving off an extremely forbidding glacial aura. Even after being sliced into two, it didn't perish. Instead, it was able to instantly fuse its body back together, and it was as if it hadn't been wounded at all. But the glacial aura that it was giving off had diminished significantly. A hint of surprise flashed through Han Li's eyes upon seeing this. And instead of fleeing the scene, the black snake hissed at Han Li in a menacing fashion, indicating that it wasn't a very intelligent creature. All of a sudden, it shot forth as a blurry shadow, vanishing without a trace, before reappearing behind Han Li and pouncing viciously at his back. A faint smile appeared on Han Li's face as he reached out with one hand, conjuring up a large azure palm projection that caught the black snake in a flash. The black snake writhed and struggled with all its might, but was unable to break free. The large azure hand brought the snake closer to Han Li and began to inspect it with slightly furrowed brows. This snake seemed to have been formed by the yin qi here, and unlike normal demon beasts, it had no physical body. In order to prepare for this trip, Han Li had read many scriptures related to soul-stirring winds, and one of them had mentioned that there were some yin beasts residing deep within the soul-stirring winds that were very difficult to deal with. This snake was undoubtedly one such yin beast. Han Li made a clenching motion with his hand, and the large azure hand immediately constructed around the black snake, crushing it into a cloud of black chi. However, instead of dissipating, the black chi began to writhe like a living creature, looking as if it were about to come together again. Han Li's expression darkened slightly as he flicked a finger through the air, releasing a bolt of divine devil-bane lightning that struck the cloud of black chi in a flash. The black chi instantly scattered as if it had met the bane of its existence, and an anguished screech rang out from within it before it completely faded away. Han Li's expression eased slightly upon seeing this, and he continued onward. It seemed that the black snake was a precursor for things to come, and Han Li was attacked by more and more yin beasts as he flew onward. These yin beasts weren't very powerful, but their insubstantial bodies made them rather difficult to deal with. Thankfully, Han Li's divine Devilbane lightning was perfect for dealing with these creatures, so he was able to dispatch them with ease. As he continued to fly onward, a hint of surprise suddenly appeared on his face. The number of pillars of soul-stirring wind around him had suddenly decreased, becoming far sparser than before. And the few pillars of wind that remained were also significantly smaller than before. Han Li was rather taken aback by this, but he continued to fly onward, and as he did so, the number of pillars of soul-stirring wind continued to decrease until they disappeared altogether. All that was left in the place of the soul-stirring winds was a boundless expanse of black mist. The glacial aura in the air had diminished significantly, and all of the yin beasts had also vanished without a trace. The disappearance of the soul-stirring winds meant that the ghastly sounds they produced had mostly subsided as well, and it seemed that he had arrived in a peaceful area of black mist. Have I already passed through the soul-stirring winds? Han Li thought to himself, but then immediately shook his head. He had only been traveling through the soul-stirring winds for less than half a month, so there was no way that he had already passed through them. He was definitely still situated within the soul-stirring winds, but he seemed to have arrived in a special area. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to find many scriptures containing information on the soul-stirring winds, and there were no records of areas like this. After a brief moment of hesitation, Han Li continued onward, but he had slowed down even further and was carefully observing everything around him with his bright sight spirit eyes. After flying for close to an entire day, there was still nothing but black mist around him. In fact, the black mist had become denser and denser until it was also substantial in form. At this point, his visibility was very limited, even with his bright sight spirit eyes. Furthermore, the mist was no longer as peaceful as before. Instead, some strange high-pitched sounds had begun ringing out within it, resembling the sound of an infant's crying. The sound wasn't very loud, and at times it was barely audible at all, but it was even more formidable than the ghastly sounds from before. He slowed down once again, and two beams of blue light that were each around a foot in length shot out of his eyes as he inspected his surroundings. After advancing through the black mist for a while, his expression suddenly changed slightly as he stopped in his tracks before casting his gaze forward. A burst of rumbling was ringing out up ahead, and the previously peaceful mist had suddenly begun to churn violently. The sound was becoming louder and louder, while the disturbance in the surrounding mist was becoming more and more violent, until it resembled a pot of boiling water. Han Li's brows were tightly furrowed, and he was considering whether to continue straight ahead or skirt around the disturbance, when all of the black mist around him suddenly began to revolve in a frenzy, forming an enormous vortex. The vortex was so massive that he wasn't even able to see it in its entirety. In fact, he wasn't even able to ascertain where its center was, and it was releasing tremendous suction force that enveloped his entire body, forcibly drawing him toward the center of the vortex. Han Li's expression darkened slightly as the azure light radiating from his body brightened significantly, and only then was he able to stabilize himself. At the same time, a black shadow shot out of the black mist up ahead. It was a giant black toad-like yin beast that was around the size of a house with lumps growing all over its body, presenting a horrific sight to behold. The black toad opened its mouth up wide to release a pillar of dense black light that hurtled directly toward Han Li, seemingly attempting to prevent him from leaving. The pillar of black light was giving off astonishing glacial power fluctuations, and it seemed to be capable of freezing the very space in its wake. Han Li harumphed coldly as he swept a sleeve through the air, releasing an azure flying sword that instantly transformed into a giant azure sword that was over 100 feet in length, with arcs of golden lightning flashing over its surface. The giant azure sword struck the pillar of black light, destroying it with ease before appearing above the toad yin beast's head and slashing down upon it. The yin beast's body was instantly cleaved into two, with divine Devilbane lightning spreading over the two halves of its body, causing them to explode into two clouds of black chi. Even though Han Li had managed to slay the yin beast, it had managed to delay him a little, and the giant vortex behind him had gotten closer to him, while the suction force that it was releasing had become even more formidable. Han Li was just about to unleash a secret technique to fly away from the area when a giant black tentacle shot out of the vortex at an incredible speed before wrapping itself around him. However, thanks to his true extreme film, the tentacle wasn't actually able to make contact with his body. His expression changed slightly upon seeing this, but he then gave a cold harumph as he made a hand seal, and two azure bamboo cloudswarm swords instantly flew out of his body before striking the black tentacle. However, the tentacle was extremely resilient, and the pair of azure bamboo cloudswarm swords were only able to slice slightly into it before being brought to a halt. A surprised look appeared in Han Li's eyes upon seeing this, and before he had a chance to do anything else, the black tentacle abruptly pulled back with tremendous force, catching him off guard and dragging him into the huge vortex. In the next instant, he appeared in the eye of a rapidly revolving storm, with deafening rumbling akin to the sound of countless thundering horse hooves ringing out around him. Bursts of tremendous suction force converged toward him from all directions, while the black tentacle remained wrapped around his body. Furthermore, it was rapidly constricting, but Han Li's true extreme film remained firm. Even though Han Li had been dragged into the vortex, he remained calm and collected, paying no heed to the black tentacle around him, as he inspected his surroundings with slightly furrowed brows. Right at this moment, a low roar rang out from deep within the vortex, following which another tentacle shot out of the darkness, before also wrapping itself around Han Li's body. Han Li withdrew his gaze before peering deep into the vortex, and a cold gleam flashed through his eyes as he made a hand seal.